The big picture is above your pay grade, Walt, he said it out loud, in front of 12 executives in a room full of clients, like it cost him nothing. I'm Walter Eckhart, 57. I've spent 25 years in commercial finance. I've built risk models, closed deals, and restructured portfolios that most guys Clifford Graves' age have never even touched. And in that moment, sitting at that conference table with a 40-page analysis I'd built from scratch, sitting right in front of him, I kept my mouth shut. Not because I didn't have an answer. Because I was waiting for the right question. I joined Vantage Capital Advisors about 11 months before that meeting. Senior Operations Analyst. The title sounded solid, and the work matched it. I'd been brought in specifically to fix a client management process that had been quietly bleeding the firm for years. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but the systems were a mess. The reporting was inconsistent, and 3 mid-sized accounts had walked in the past 18 months without anyone understanding exactly why. I figured out why in the first 3 weeks. Built a repair plan in the next 2, had it implemented in 60 days. Vantage was a good firm overall, mid-sized, strong reputation in commercial lending and asset management based out of Pittsburgh, the kind of place where people had been doing things a certain way for a long time, and mostly it worked, except when it didn't. I'd worked in places like it before. I knew the rhythms. What I didn't know yet was how much of the firm's internal politics ran through one family. Clifford Graves was 36, Director of Client Acquisitions, and the son of Lionel Graves, our VP of Operations. Lionel had been at Vantage for 16 years. He was well-liked, old school, the kind of guy who remembered everybody's birthday and had lunch with Howard Mercer, our CEO, every other Friday. His son had come up through the firm the way sons of connected men tend to, quickly, smoothly, and with a generous interpretation of his contributions. Clifford was not stupid. I want to be clear about that. He was sharp, well-dressed, and genuinely good at walking into a room and making people feel like they were the most important person in it. He had instincts for relationships that I've never had and probably never will. In a different situation, those instincts would have made him a strong director. The problem was that he'd spent several years skimming off the work of people around him and calling it strategy. And by the time I arrived, it had become habit. I noticed it first around month 2. I'd been putting together a competitive analysis on a segment of the market Vantage hadn't touched yet. Nothing assigned, just something I'd spotted and thought was worth flagging. I sent it to Clifford with a note suggesting it might be worth a conversation. 2 weeks later, Howard mentioned in a team meeting that Clifford had brought some sharp new thinking to his attention about an underserved market segment. He didn't name names. Clifford nodded like he was accepting a reasonable compliment. I wrote it down that evening. Date, time, what was said, who was in the room. I didn't do it because I had a plan. I did it because I needed to know I wasn't imagining things. There's a specific kind of self-doubt that sets in when someone consistently reframes your work as their idea. After a while, you start to wonder if maybe you're reading too much into it. The documentation kept me anchored. Every entry was proof that what I was seeing was real. My colleague Floyd Kowalski had been at Vantage longer than anyone on our floor. He was 55, methodical, the kind of analyst who still printed everything and kept physical files organized by quarter going back years. He noticed what was happening to me before I said a word about it to anyone. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk, set a coffee down, and said, "Save everything. Emails, drafts, anything with a timestamp. Print what matters, and keep it somewhere that isn't your work computer." I asked him why he was telling me that. He just said, "Because I've seen this before, and the people who were ready for it came out fine. The ones who weren't didn't." I started printing things after that. My direct supervisor, Sylvia Randolph, was a good manager, honest, experienced, and genuinely in my corner, but she was also practical about the landscape. When I brought my concerns to her in month 4, she listened carefully, then said, "Document everything. Build your case quietly. Lionel Graves has been here since before half this floor was hired." She paused. "Just be patient and be ready." I was both. The Ashford account came onto my radar in month 5. Gerald Ashford ran Ashford Capital Group out of a mid-rise office in the Strip District, about 10 minutes from our building. He'd built the firm over 40 years starting with nothing, literally working a mill job in his 20s while getting his finance license at night. By the time I came across his name, Ashford Capital was managing close to $200 million in assets and looking for a new advisory relationship after a quiet falling out with their previous firm. I found the lead through an old industry contact. Did 3 days of background research before I even mentioned it internally. Then I put together a full brief, portfolio overview, risk profile, where we could add value, why our platform fit their specific 5-year goals. Sent it to Clifford with a detailed summary and a note recommending we move quickly because at least 2 other firms were likely circling. Clifford replied with one line, "Thanks, I'll take a look." He never followed up with me directly. 2 weeks later, Howard mentioned in a leadership meeting that Clifford had surfaced a promising new prospect worth pursuing. The name Ashford Capital came up. My brief did not. I wrote it down. Floyd printed a copy of the original email I'd sent, time-stamped, and kept it in his files without telling me. I found that out later. Over the next few months, I watched Clifford build the Ashford pitch on the back of my brief without ever crediting a word of it. He'd reference his team's research in meetings. He'd mention the analysis we've been developing to Howard. Every time I heard it, I added another line to my log. What I didn't do was confront him. Not because I was afraid of him, but because I understood something important. A man like Clifford, with his father sitting 2 floors up, was not going to respond to a direct accusation by admitting anything. He'd smile, express confusion, suggest I had misunderstood the collaborative nature of the work, and then walk upstairs and have lunch with Lionel. Whatever capital I had at Vantage would evaporate inside 48 hours. So I kept working, and I waited. When Howard told me he wanted me in the room for the Ashford pitch, I didn't let myself get too excited. I'd heard similar things before and seen how they played out. What I did do was prepare like the meeting was entirely mine to carry. I spent 2 weeks on that 40-page analysis, every number sourced and verified, every assumption documented. I built a stress test model for 3 different rate scenarios and cross-referenced it against Ashford Capital's last 4 years of public filings. I knew their portfolio better than some people who had been managing it. The night before the meeting, I went through the whole deck twice, not to memorize it. I already knew it. I went through it because I wanted to be able to answer any question from any page without looking down. I also did something I hadn't done before. I told Floyd the meeting was the next morning and that Howard had asked me to present the analysis. Floyd nodded slowly. He didn't say much. Just, I'll be around tomorrow afternoon if anything comes up. I didn't know exactly what he meant by that. I didn't ask the morning of the meeting. I arrived early. Set up the conference room, checked the projector, arranged the packets. The big room had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the river. It was the room they used when the client mattered. Gerald Ashford arrived exactly on time with 4 people from his team, all of them serious and none of them there to be charmed. Introductions went around the table. When it got to me, Clifford smoothly cut across, and this is Walter. He handles the administrative side of our analytics. He's put together some background materials we'll be referencing today. I said evenly, actually, I'm the senior operations analyst. I built the full analysis we'll be presenting. Clifford smiled like I'd made a minor procedural correction and moved on. The first half of the meeting ran the way those meetings usually do. Charts, projections, market positioning, growth targets. Clifford was polished. He knew the big picture narrative cold because I had written it for him. He moved through the slides with the confidence of someone who had spent years making other people's thinking sound like his own. Then Gerald Ashford's CFO, a woman named Patricia Holt, stopped the room. She asked about the interest rate stress test on page 22. Specifically, she wanted the assumptions behind the 150 basis point scenario and how it interacted with the liquidity buffer calculation. Clifford nodded. Said it was a great question, said his team had examined a range of scenarios, said they'd factored in multiple outcomes. Patricia waited. The room waited. Clifford glanced at the page, then at his notes, then back at the page. I gave him about 5 seconds. Then I said, the stress test applies a 150 basis point shock at month 9 of the projection window. At that rate, the liquidity buffer holds at 14.3%, which stays above your internal threshold of 12. The break-even shifts from month 19 to month 22, but the margin of safety remains intact through the full 36-month window. Patricia looked at me directly. What's the sensitivity at 200 basis points? Buffer drops to 11.8%, which puts it just below your threshold. Page 24 has a full sensitivity table if you want to run additional scenarios against your own assumptions. She flipped to page 24. Studied it for a moment, nodded. Gerald Ashford, who had been quiet at the head of the table, leaned back slightly and looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the look of someone who had spent decades figuring out in the first 10 minutes of a meeting who actually knew what they were talking about. He asked about the asset concentration risk in Ashford Capital's real estate holdings. I walked him through it. He asked about the reallocation logic in the 3rd-year projection. I explained the reasoning behind each step. He asked one more question about the fee structure implications under a rising rate environment. I answered that too. At some point, I became aware that Clifford had stopped talking entirely. Howard Mercer, sitting at the far end of the table, said quietly, Walter, why don't you take us through the rest? It wasn't really a question. I stood up, moved to the front of the room, and finished the presentation. All of it. Without looking at my notes once, when it ended, Gerald Ashford stood, walked down to my end of the table, and shook my hand. That's the most thorough risk analysis anyone has brought us in 3 years, he said. I want you running point on this account. He didn't walk to Clifford's end of the table. I registered that. I didn't show it on my face, but I registered it. 25 years of having your work absorbed into someone else's credit. And a 68-year-old man who built his firm from nothing just looked past all of it and shook the right hand. I let that land quietly and then focused on the next thing. The next thing was Clifford, catching up to me in the hallway outside the elevators about 4 minutes later. "No offense, Walt," he said, with the same smooth confidence he always carried, "but client relationships are a different skill set. You're good with the numbers, genuinely, but Howard will sort out how this account gets structured." I looked at him for a moment. Gerald just asked me to run point. Clifford's expression stayed level. "Howard will sort it out," he said again. He believed that. Right up until Howard sorted it out at 2:47 that afternoon, Sylvia texted me, "CEO's office, 3 p.m. You okay?" I texted back a thumbs up. I didn't entirely feel it, but I wasn't going to say that. I spent the next hour at my desk doing routine work and not thinking too hard about what was waiting for me upstairs. I'd been in enough of these meetings over 25 years to know that the version you imagine in the waiting is almost never the version that actually happens. Sometimes worse, sometimes better, rarely the same. I rode the elevator to the executive floor at 2:58. Howard's assistant showed me straight in. The room was already occupied. Clifford sat to the left of Howard's desk, jacket still on, posture managed. Sylvia sat across from him. Renee Caldwell from HR occupied the chair nearest the door, and Floyd Kowalski sat in the far corner with a manila folder on his knee, rubber band around it, looking like a man who had been waiting for this particular afternoon for a while. I understood then what Floyd had meant when he said he'd be around. Howard gestured to the empty chair. I sat down. Nobody spoke for a moment. Howard started by asking me to describe what had been happening over the past 11 months. Not as an accusation toward anyone, just tell me what you've experienced. I did. I kept it factual and specific, the competitive analysis in month 2 that surfaced in a leadership meeting under Clifford's name, the Ashford brief I sent in month 5 that became Clifford's promising new prospect, the pattern of being introduced as administrative support in internal meetings despite my title, the reports forwarded to the board with my analysis intact and my name removed. I gave dates where I had them and approximate timeframes where I didn't. Clifford interrupted twice. The first time he called it a mischaracterization. The second time he said the forwarding of documents was standard practice on his team and that attribution was a collaborative matter. Howard stopped him both times with a short, flat, let Walter finish. When I was done, Howard looked at Floyd. Floyd opened the folder. He laid 2 documents on the desk side by side. The first was the original brief I had emailed to Clifford about Ashford Capital. Timestamped 6 months earlier, my name at the top, my analysis throughout. The second was the version Clifford had forwarded to Howard 2 weeks after receiving it. My analysis was intact, my name was gone, Clifford's name was in the header. The room went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. Clifford looked at the 2 documents for a moment, then he said it was a formatting issue, an oversight in how his assistant prepared forwarded documents. He said he had always intended to credit the contributing team members in the full presentation. Renee Caldwell leaned forward. She asked him to explain why the same pattern appeared in 3 separate board submissions over the prior quarter, all containing sections that matched documents Walter had originated, none of them carrying Walter's name. Clifford said that was a process issue his team would address going forward. Renee said, "I've spoken to 5 people on your floor independently this week. Their accounts are consistent with Walter's." That was the first time I saw something other than composure on Clifford's face. It was brief, and he covered it quickly, but it was there. He hadn't known about those conversations. He shifted in his chair and changed approach. He said that Walter was a valuable analyst, but that client strategy was a senior function requiring relationship management experience Walter hadn't demonstrated. He said the Ashford account needed continuity of contact that he had been building for months. He said reassigning lead contact mid-process would damage the client relationship. Howard said Gerald Ashford called me personally this afternoon. He was clear about who he wants as his primary contact. He said if that person isn't Walter, they'll find a different advisory firm. Clifford went still. Then the door opened. Lionel Graves stepped in. I hadn't known he was coming. From the look on Renee's face, she hadn't either. He was 63, silver-haired, the kind of presence that had spent 16 years accumulating weight in a room. He stood just inside the doorway and looked at his son with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not panic, not anger. Something more tired than either of those. "Howard," he said, "I'd like a moment with Clifford before this goes any further." Howard said quietly but without hesitation, "Lionel, I have to ask you to step back from this conversation entirely. Given your relationship to Clifford, you have a conflict of interest in any decision made here today. Renee has already flagged this to the board. Lionel didn't move for a moment. He looked at his son. Clifford was staring at the desk. Then Lionel nodded once and left. That was it. No argument, no push. I think on some level Lionel Graves had known this day was possible for longer than any of us had. When you spend years giving a talented but shortcuts-prone son a soft landing inside your own firm, you have to know somewhere in the back of your mind that the ground can shift. Howard waited until the door closed. Then he continued, Clifford made one more attempt. He said this was being elevated beyond what the situation warranted. He said a few attribution errors and a difficult meeting didn't constitute a pattern of misconduct. He said he had years of relationship equity advantage that deserved consideration. Howard said, Clifford, we've been talking for 40 minutes and you've offered 4 different explanations for the same set of documents. I'm done with explanations. He removed Clifford from the Ashford account effective immediately. Pending a full review, Clifford was placed on administrative leave. Lionel Graves was formally recused from any personnel or compensation decisions involving Walter, with written acknowledgement required from both parties. Clifford stood up. For a second I thought he was going to say something else. Instead, he straightened his jacket, picked up nothing from the desk because he had brought nothing into the room, and walked out. The door closed behind him. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Howard looked at me and said, I owe you an apology. I should have known what was happening in my own firm. I didn't have a prepared answer for that, so I just said, I'd like the chance to do the job properly. Howard slid a folder across the desk. That's what we're going to talk about next. The folder Howard slid across the desk had my name on the tab. Inside was a single sheet with a new title at the top, Senior Investment Strategist, reporting directly to Sylvia Randolph. Full authority to staff my own team, lead contact for Ashford Capital Group. At the bottom of the page was a number, my current salary with a 31% adjustment applied. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it the first time, because after 11 months of watching my work disappear into someone else's name, I needed a second to accept that what I was reading was real and not another version of the same thing I'd been living through. Howard said, You'll have the resources to build the team the right way. I want your recommendations on staffing within 30 days. I said I'd have them in 2 weeks. Sylvia caught my eye across the table. She didn't smile exactly. She just gave me a small nod, the kind that meant she'd been waiting for this room to happen for a long time and was glad it finally had. I signed the sheet, shook Howard's hand, walked back to my desk and sat down and did not do anything dramatic. I finished the work that was still open on my screen, sent 2 emails that needed sending. Then I shut down my computer, got my coat, and went home. That night I ate dinner, watched about 20 minutes of a game I couldn't focus on, and went to bed early. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the specific kind of tired that comes not from one hard day but from 11 months of carrying something heavy and finally being allowed to put it down. The next morning I came in and started building. Over the next 3 weeks I assembled my team. I wasn't looking for the most credentialed people or the most polished presenters. I was looking for people who actually understood the work and weren't afraid to say when something didn't add up. I pulled Floyd in as my senior analyst. He accepted without much discussion, like it had already been settled in his mind before I asked. I brought in 2 analysts from other departments who had been underutilized for reasons that had more to do with internal politics than their actual ability. I added a junior associate fresh out of Carnegie Mellon who reminded me of myself at that age, meaning she asked better questions than most people twice her experience. Clifford's administrative leave ended 2 weeks after the meeting. He came back briefly, was assigned to a smaller regional account with no team under him, and was gone within a month after that. Mutual separation, the firm called it. I heard through Floyd that he'd landed at a smaller firm on the South Side and told people he'd been pushed out by internal politics. Maybe he believed that. I stopped thinking about it around the time we closed the first review with Ashford Capital. Lionel Graves stayed. We passed each other in the building maybe twice a month. It was always polite, always brief. He knew what had happened. I didn't need him to say it, and he didn't offer. Some things don't require acknowledgement to be understood by both parties. He kept his distance from anything touching my accounts, which was all I'd ever needed from him. Gerald Ashford turned out to be exactly the kind of client you spend a career hoping to work with. He was direct, well-prepared, and had no patience for presentations that dressed up thin thinking in confident language. In our first formal review, he stopped me 3 times to ask follow-up questions that went deeper than the slide. I answered all 3 without looking at my notes. By the end of the meeting, he had stopped asking if I was sure about things and started just listening. 6 months in, Ashford Capital increased their commitment by $8 million. My team had identified 3 areas in their portfolio where their previous advisors had been playing it too safe relative to their actual risk tolerance and long-term goals. Gerald didn't increase the commitment because we pitched him on it. He increased it because the numbers we showed him over 6 months matched what we had projected in the original analysis. Trust built from results, not from relationship management. That's a distinction I've believed in my whole career. Clifford was very good at the relationship part. What he never understood was that for clients like Gerald Ashford, the relationship is downstream of the work. You earn the trust by being right consistently over time. The lunch conversations and the firm handshakes come after. They don't come instead. One afternoon, about 7 months after the Ashford account closed, Gerald stopped by my office unannounced. He did that occasionally, not for formal business, just to talk. We developed the kind of professional rapport that happens sometimes between two people who respect each other's judgment and don't waste each other's time. He sat down across from my desk and looked around the office for a moment. It was still sparse. I'd never been a decorator. A few files, a whiteboard with a current model sketched out, a photo of my daughter at her college graduation. He said, "You know, when I walked into that meeting last year, I had already decided Vantage probably wasn't the right fit." I said, "What changed your mind?" He said, "Patricia asked a question that the room couldn't answer, and you answered it without blinking. I've been in enough meetings to know what that means." He leaned forward slightly. "I built this firm because every banker I walked into in 1987 looked at a guy from Braddock with a mill job on his resume and decided the conversation was already over. I had to know more than every person in every room just to get the door to stay open. After a while, that stops feeling like a disadvantage and starts feeling like the only foundation worth building on." He looked at me steadily. "You know something about that," I said. 25 years of it." He nodded. "Then you already know the only answer that ever worked." I did. I'd known it for a long time. But there's a difference between knowing something and having someone who built $200 million from nothing sit across your desk and confirm it. I was invited to speak at the Mid-Atlantic Commercial Banking Summit 10 months after the Ashford account closed. The topic they gave me was sustainable risk modeling in commercial lending portfolios. I accepted. The night before the conference, I thought about how to open. I stood at the podium in a ballroom with about 300 people in it, finance professionals, lenders, analysts, a few executives I recognized from rival firms. The kind of crowd that had heard 1,000 presentations and could tell inside the first 2 minutes whether the person at the front of the room actually knew what they were talking about. The moderator introduced me as Senior Investment Strategist at Vantage Capital Advisors, architect of a risk modeling approach that had attracted 4 new major accounts over the prior year. He listed a few credentials. The room gave polite attention. I set my notes on the podium and didn't look at them once. I opened with the stress test question, the exact one Patricia Holt had asked in the Ashford meeting 10 months earlier. I put it on the screen and asked the room to take 30 seconds and think about how they would answer it if a client asked it cold. In the middle of a pitch with $22 million on the table and the whole room watching. A few people shifted in their seats. A few others leaned forward. Then I walked them through the answer. Not because the answer itself was complicated, but because the answer was only possible if you had done the work underneath it long before the question got asked. The model, the sourcing, the scenario testing, the cross-referencing against the client's own stated thresholds. None of that happens in the meeting. It happens in the 2 weeks before the meeting when nobody is watching and there's no applause for it. And the only reason to do it thoroughly is because you believe the work itself is the point. That's what I talked about for 40 minutes. Not the story of Clifford Graves, not the meeting, not the folder, not the promotion. I talked about what it actually takes to build analysis that holds up when a serious client applies serious pressure to it. The discipline of it, the patience of it, the particular satisfaction of knowing your numbers cold enough that when the hard question arrives, you don't have to check anything. Afterward, a line of people waited to talk, mostly men around my age, some a little younger, a few older. Several of them mentioned that they were dealing with similar dynamics at their firms. Younger colleagues who moved fast and talked well and had figured out that confidence could travel a long distance before the invoice came due. A few of them asked how I had handled it without blowing everything up. I told them the same thing every time. I did the work, I documented everything, and I waited for a question that required a real answer. One guy, probably 54 or 55, gray at the temples, handed me his card as the line was thinning out. He'd written something on the back. I read it after he walked away. Been waiting 3 years for someone to say this out loud. Thank you. That card is in my desk drawer now, next to a printed copy of the original Ashford brief with my name at the top and Floyd's initials in the corner, where he signed it before he filed it away 6 months before anyone needed it. I think about that brief sometimes, about the fact that I wrote it, sent it, got no response and kept working anyway. About Floyd printing it quietly and saying nothing, about the 6 months it sat in a manila folder waiting for an afternoon that might never have come. Most of the time, the folder stays in the drawer. Most of the time, the work just gets done and credited correctly, and none of this is necessary. But sometimes it isn't. And when it isn't, the only thing that matters is whether you were paying attention and whether you were ready. I was ready because I kept doing the work even when the work was disappearing. That's the part people don't talk about enough. It's easy to stay sharp when you're being recognized. The harder thing is staying sharp when someone is systematically making you invisible and every reasonable instinct is telling you to pull back, do less, protect yourself by making yourself smaller. I didn't do that, not because I'm built differently than anyone else. Because I knew that the moment I stopped being the most prepared person in the room, I'd have nothing left. The documentation mattered. The relationships with Floyd and Sylvia mattered. But none of it would have meant anything if I hadn't known every number in that deck cold when Gerald Ashford, CFO, asked the question. That's the foundation. Everything else is built on top of it. If you've been in that room, maybe not the same conference table, maybe not the same industry, but that same situation where someone younger or louder or better connected decided your 25 years was just background noise in a story you actually wrote. Here's what I want you to document everything. Not because you're planning to go to war, because it keeps you anchored to what's real when someone is working hard to make you doubt yourself. Know your work better than anyone in the room, not to show off. Because when the right question gets asked at the right moment, the answer either comes from you or it doesn't. There's no substitute for that and no shortcut to it. And when someone tells you the big picture is above your pay grade, let them finish. Then answer the question they can't. That's not a clever tactic. That's 25 years. And 25 years doesn't disappear just because somebody decided it was convenient to look past it. You built what you built. Don't let anyone forward it under their name.